Every day, Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's biologists, educators, game wardens, and other staff members report to some widespread wild locations. For these folks, there's no such thing as a typical day. I'm Katie Yates, and this is Season 1 of Fishin' Game Changers. Today I sit down with Sarah Spencer, a wildlife biologist with a slightly different focus than what you've heard from wildlife biologists in earlier episodes. We meet in our Augusta office, which is a little different than the wilderness setting where Sarah is usually found.
I'm Sarah Spencer. I'm a wildlife biologist for the department. My position is really as a habitat specialist, and I work directly with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry's Bureau of Parks and Lands as a habitat specialist with them. And I work with their foresters and their recreation specialists and their administrators to ensure that wildlife considerations are made on all of their acreage across the state. So every acre on Bureau of Parks and Lands property has what's called a dominant use, and some acres have secondary uses. So in some places, wildlife, for example, has been deemed the dominant use, meaning the primary use. Wildlife is the priority on those acres, and everything else comes secondary, including timber harvesting, recreation, any sort of other interest would come secondary to wildlife management.
Sarah monitors habitat for wildlife on Bureau of Parks and Lands acreage. In Maine, the Bureau of Parks and Lands, also known as BPL, is a bureau within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and it manages over 700,000 acres of state parks, public land, and state historic sites. The Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, my department, is a separate entity which manages wildlife, inland fisheries, wildlife management areas, hunting and fishing regulations, ATV and snowmobile registrations, things like that. The Bureau of Parks and Lands and the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife might be separate, but our cooperation and coordination is essential for the good of our natural resources, and that's why Sarah's role is so vital.
Oh, a typical day is very non-typical. So every day is a little bit different. What's kind of nice about my job, and I didn't get into it because of this, but I sort of, for the most part, I get to pick what days I go in the field. So I try to pile up my office work for when it's really rainy and or just poor weather conditions in general, and then schedule my field work for sort of nicer stints where I can be in the field for several days. There's a lot of planning that goes into every day in the field for the most part. So it's a lot of map making, being prepared, getting all of my information in hand prior to going in the field. And then when I'm in the field, it's a lot of data collection, and that's either done on paper in a field notebook, or we're using iPads and iPhones and different data devices to record different things.
And what are you looking for?
So it depends on what I'm doing, but for example, I spend a lot of time walking around in deer wintering areas and looking for signs of deer use. So I would be in
the winter season, when the snow is deep enough that the deer aren't roaming freely around the landscape, Sarah trudges out into the woods to map where the deer are traveling, bedding, and browsing.
Beds and signs of browse, looking for areas where we might be able to improve browse conditions. So,
is that browsing for food?
Yeah, so what deer are eating in the winter? They're eating a lot of hardwood stems. They'll eat cedar branches that they can either reach. They don't climb trees, but they'll stand up on their hind legs and try to reach some softwood branches to eat, or things that fall down actually from the canopy onto the top of the snow and the icy crust. But that hardwood browse, that's something we can actually manage.
Sarah uses her powerful observational skills and knowledge of the environment to identify management opportunities. She then turns these observations into actions, informing management practices on the landscape, which will help wildlife of all kinds flourish. I'm kind of imagining you going out.
Yeah.
The forest is the most inaccessible.
Yeah.
So trudging through deep snow.
And it's not It's not easy. I mean, I get used to it, but when I describe it to people, I sometimes get a little bit of a, like, you do what?
The intense work of observing the landscape at its most rugged is something Sarah prepares for extensively.
It's really important to be prepared. So it usually involves several hours of driving from my office in the morning. Sometimes it involves some overnight stays, some multi-day adventures, mainly because it's so far away. I don't want to spend my whole week just driving back and forth. But it's things like making sure your snowmobile is prepared and you have plenty of fuel and gas and spare parts and whatever you need. Making sure you're prepared to spend a night outside potentially in the winter, which, I think sometimes we take for granted a little bit that very rarely would ever happen. But you never know when you have an equipment failure. And for the most part, I'm spending my days with another person, usually with one of the foresters out on the landscape, sometimes with another biologist. But yeah, some days I'm by myself. So it's snowmobiling followed by snowshoeing. And you just hope at the end of the day, your snowmobile is going to run and get you back to the truck and back home, or back to whatever camp you're staying at for the night. I didn't grow up snowmobiling. I didn't even really grow up hunting. I grew up in the woods, off the grid, but a slightly different lifestyle than maybe a lot of Mainers kind of grow up in. And so when I kind of started in this field, I really had to learn a lot of those things that a lot of people just knew. One of my very first full-time jobs, I think my supervisor sort of took for granted that he figured I probably had already been on a snowmobile. And so I had to be really upfront and let him know, hey, I haven't done this before. I don't even know how to start this machine. So I really had to learn from the very beginning. Now I feel really comfortable with it, but there was a time where, it made me nervous every time I went out, and it took a lot of experience to just get comfortable with it and be really comfortable with the feeling of being out there, 20 miles from my vehicle, and have the sun go down, which happens pretty early during the winter time. And same thing with an ATV, learning how to safely operate that. And you learn some of it in a safety course, but then a lot of it is on the ground. And having really good mentors to teach you is extremely important. So it's been a slightly different experience. And the more I talk about it, the more I find that I think it's a little bit more common than I thought when I first started. That not everybody has this experience. You can have the knowledge, but not necessarily the experience to do it. And it takes someone sort of giving you a chance to get that experience and make it happen.
You said that you didn't grow up doing this.
Yeah.
So what was that? What got you to this point? I mean, did you have an outdoorsy upbringing?
Yeah. So I grew up off the grid in the woods, kind of on a woodlot homestead sort of situation. So we didn't have, power lines running to our house. Our house ran off really just a generator, and it was only run sometimes. But we had propane lights, propane refrigerator and stove, and I thought it was pretty normal. And then, got to middle school and high school and realized not everyone grows up like this. This is a little bit different, and went through my teen years struggling with that a little bit. Sort of back to the land movement type folks. But, so I grew up on this woodlot, really, with my brother. And for us to entertain ourselves, I mean, we didn't really watch TV, maybe at night if the generator was on. But, we sort of had to invent our own games. So we would go explore. We had a river behind our house, lots of wetlands and just forest everywhere. And so my brother and I would explore and just had to be back, at the end of the day sort of thing.
Sarah turned her family's lifestyle and her interest in wildlife and nature into a career. It was a teacher in high school that helped her make the connection.
Really, it was a teacher in high school that emphasized to me that I could make my interest in wildlife a career. So like a lot of kids, I thought, I want to be a veterinarian. I love animals. I want to work with animals. And this teacher I had in high school, was fortunate enough that he pushed to get some sort of alternative classes in our high school. Kind of at the time, they were considered maybe a little bit more alternative. So he had permission to teach a marine biology course and wildlife biology, as well as anatomy and physiology, which weren't really common high school courses at the time. And the wildlife biology and marine biology classes really interested me a lot. And I told him at one point, I said, this is my interest. I want to do things that create habitat for wildlife. That was sort of my vague interest at the time. But all of the role models in that field that I saw pictures of were all men. And it wasn't that I thought, oh, I'm a female, I can't do this, but it was just, there weren't necessarily readily accessible images of women doing that kind of work. And I remember having that conversation with him, and he said, you can do that, absolutely. You're capable, anybody can do it. I'm sure there's women out there. Why don't you look for some college programs in wildlife and see if there's any locally. And I think he knew that the University of Maine had a wildlife program, but he really kind of encouraged that. So yeah, I ended up going to the University of Maine and getting a degree in wildlife ecology. And there I really met a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, whether they were from Maine or New England or somewhere else in the country, and realized that every single individual there had a slightly different background. And I was a little intimidated at first because I didn't hunt when I was growing up. I mean, I had taken hunter safety and conservation camp in middle school, but I never really applied that until I went to college. And thankfully, I think because of the place we were in our lives, these young adults trying to figure everything out, everybody shared their experiences with each other. So I was able to share my experience of ice fishing and loving fishing with some of my classmates who hadn't had that experience, and they were able to share their passion for hunting with me.
Over the course of collecting interviews for this series, I was surprised to hear from biologists like Sarah, who took a love of the outdoors, made it a career, and even furthered their connection by going hunting for the first time as an adult.
Kind of a high barrier for entry with hunting, I felt like. And
especially in college,
yeah, you have very limited resources, and I had limited time. I was really focusing on my academics. So, but just after college, I remember working a position, working on a variety of different things with our bird group, actually, here in the department. And the person I was working for offered to take me duck hunting. It was a really great experience. And, I still struggle with finding the time and, making the effort to get out there and do it as much as I'd like to. But I definitely, I have the bug, maybe not as much as some other folks, but sometimes I have to remind myself when I'm sitting in my tree stand. Just this past fall, that happened. I remind myself just how much I enjoy being in the woods at dawn when everything is waking up for the day. It's something that come 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, it's a very different scene than it is right before the sun comes up, during twilight in the morning. And it's less about hunting and harvesting an animal for me as it is about just being outside and kind of being in touch with what's going on, what all the animals are doing. Now, when I'm not seeing deer, I really don't mind watching squirrels doing their thing and, putting acorns away in a cache for the winter and that sort of thing. It's an enjoyable experience. It's just a time to sort of slow down and remember that we're not the only thing on the landscape and just kind of enjoy it for a little while.
It sounds like the forest is really your happy place.
It is.
I asked Sarah about her favorite moments while on the job. She tells me about waterfowl brood production surveys, where they count hatchlings on water bodies.
So one of my favorite things to do are waterfowl brood production surveys. So there's water bodies across the state that every year wildlife biologists go to twice during the summer, once in June and once in July. We're looking for waterfowl and ducklings to record to better understand production of waterfowl. Being on these water bodies at dawn is just one of the greatest places and moments to be. Everything is sort of waking up at that time of day, right? The sun, you start as soon as you can see enough to identify what you're looking for.
While paddling along the shoreline quietly at dawn, she had a few close encounters with wildlife.
So one of them was with river otters, which are, if I had to pick a favorite species in Maine, they'd probably be in the top 3. They're just really dynamic, they're a very charismatic species. A female was swimming around, and I could see some other movement, and so I knew there were young around as well. And they came probably within, I'd say, 10 to 15 feet of my kayak. They're kind of raising their upper bodies out of the water and snorting, sniffing. You could hear them breathing. And on a subsequent visit, I heard something. And so I just stopped for a minute, and I was probably only 4 or 5 feet off the shore at that point. And I saw some vegetation moving, so I just stopped and let the kayak stop. And a raccoon came out of the bushes on this little rock and proceeded to start digging in the mud. And it was digging up a freshwater mussel. They have really dexterous paws, so they can really manipulate things. And I watched as it dug this off and washed it off. And it was just the neatest thing to see.
Sarah's day-to-day job is like catching the live version of a wildlife documentary.
I saw deer walk away. And after we'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes had passed, I saw some movement over to my left, and I looked over, and this fawn, this really, really tiny spotted fawn, stood up and sort of stretched, like a dog or a cat, turned around and laid back down. And it was just the neatest thing to see that this doe had placed this fawn there. It was just, just the most beautiful little moment.
Yeah. Do you feel like David Attenborough?
I guess maybe if I narrated it really charismatically, I don't think I had that trait or that skill. But
so why do you think you're passionate about the work that you do?
I mean, it's a way of life. It's a part of my lifestyle. I mean, when I go home at the end of the day, I don't shut off my interest in my career. And I think I'm fortunate in that. But, even at home, I love to find new perennials that are really great for pollinators in my yard, for example, or on our few acres that we live on, doing what we can to provide, whether it's food or water or shelter for different species of wildlife. And so it's not something I can really shut off. It's just a way of life, and I really think that my upbringing fostered that. I mean, when I go on vacation, we go snowshoeing and cross-country skiing in the Rockies and fishing for trout on western trout rivers and all those things that I might do similar sort of things for work, to do my work, but those are the things I enjoy doing.
It must be interesting doing it recreationally, and kind of reminds you why the management side of things is so important.
Yeah. I feel fortunate to be entrusted with the position, these resources, to manage them, to make recommendations for management. It's, it's not something I take lightly, for sure. I love it.
To read some of Sarah's blog posts, visit emmyfishwildlife.com/changers. Next Monday, I trek deep into the woods with our black bear and Canada lynx biologist and our bear crew for a very special episode of Fish and Game Changers.